Good morning, everyone. I'm Bev Neufeld, most of you know, and I'm president and founder of PowHer New York. We're a network of over 100 organizations across New York State. And what's unique about what we do is we bring people together across issue areas, across regions, and we've agreed to collaborate on different issues. So we've done many collaborations over the years, and quite a few of them, the ultimate goal of PowHer is economic equity. So today's conversation is especially important. I think as advocates, we understand that no matter how visionary and needed our policies are, they're going to fail if they don't have adequate investment and commitment from leadership. So this is a particularly important question because the minimum wage issue and the one fair wage issue, which we'll talk about, really is about finances, for families. Last week, we had a deep dive briefing on the care economy. See, everyone saying hi? On the care economy and on reproductive justice, which was just great. And that gave people information that they could then take out to their networks. And so we can have broader, deeper conversations about these issues in our communities. So for the start of Women's History Month, which is a very, very busy month for everyone, we thought this would be a great way to start talking about, wages, economic equity, and we have an amazing panel. Before we get into that, I just want everyone to know that we'll be putting links into the chat as usual, and you can put your questions into the chat or the Q&A. We'll be, watching them throughout the session, and that we are recording this and that we'll have it online after so you could share it. I think the speakers are going to mention quite a number of resources, and we'll collect all of those and then send them to everyone as well. So we have a terrific panel here, starting with Senator Jessica Ramos, who is the head of the Labor Committee and the sponsor of the Raise the Wage Act. And then we have Emerita Torres, I see Emerita from Community Service Society, Ayanat Sabika from One Fair Wage, Yanette Lathrop from National Employment Law Project, NELP. And then Merville Reagan will round off the conversation. Merville's worked for 20 years on what is the cost of living and how much does it cost to live in New York. So that's the whole point, right, of what we need a minimum wage for, so we can afford to live in this wonderful state. So Senator Ramos, let's get started.
I love it. Buenos dias, Beverly. How are you?
Oh, terrific. It's a great morning.
Yes, no, this is a great way to kick off the second day of Women's History.
Yes.
So thank you so much for bringing us together on such an important topic, which is our money. As women, we've always struggled to be able to achieve equal pay. And we've done a lot of work with PowHer over the last few years, particularly to pass our salary disclosure bill that we're very eager to see implemented and hopefully complied with by all those corporations. But today we are talking about minimum wage workers. And so often minimum wage workers are precisely women, and especially heads of households. This year, we have reintroduced our Raise the Wage Act. It is a bill that I carry with Assemblywoman LaToya Joyner, who is the chair of the Labor Committee in the New York State Assembly. And we seek to raise the minimum wage to $21.25 by the year 2026, at which point we will be indexing the minimum wage to inflation, meaning that as the cost of living goes up, so should the minimum wage, with little discourse, with little debate, I should say, so that we are not stuck in these deep-seated fights between big business and rank and file workers who are just trying to get by. Everyone across New York State, I think, is feeling the squeeze right now. And that's why we want to be able to help workers earn a little more so that they are able to make ends meet, keep a roof over their heads, et cetera, et cetera. And we are trying to get our bill passed in the New York State budget this year. We are in conflict with the governor's proposal, unfortunately. She has proposed in her executive budget to tie the minimum wage to inflation, but not raise it, which we see as a very, very big problem because we've been at a $15 minimum wage in New York State since 2019. And it took us many, many years to get there. And when we did, by 2019, $15 wasn't even a living wage anymore. So we want to be very careful about not codifying poverty wages and actually putting people on a path to where they're not only able to exist, but actually thrive and perhaps even save for a rainy day. That's the idea. That's how hopefully we'll be able to help folks embark on their path into the middle class. You know, I know you're thinking, well, the minimum wage is largely for the private sector, it's for businesses. So why the urgency? Why does it have to get done in the budget? But you see, there are some job titles, particularly when it comes to home care attendants, who are deeply impacted by the minimum wage. And actually, there's unfortunately another proposal in the executive budget this year that actually does away with a lot of the work that home care attendants have been doing to achieve fair pay for their work over the past few years themselves. Last year, they were able to advocate and successfully win a $3 raise. They always seek to be at 150% of the minimum wage. And of course, I'm sure you all know, home care attendants are largely women, and particularly women of color. And so we want to make sure that they, of course, are able to live with dignity and the respect they deserve as well. So this big Raise the Wage Act fight is for them. It is for every woman and every person who is working a minimum wage job. I know a lot of people think that minimum wage earners are teenagers. They are not. Actually, only 5% of minimum wage earners in New York State are teenagers. The rest are actually people, including our seniors, who upon living on fixed incomes have found themselves in need of continuing to work because they haven't been able to truly retire, and that Social Security check just isn't enough. And I won't go into get on my soapbox on why pensions are so important. That's perhaps for another conversation, but we do want to make sure that we are delivering for New Yorkers in this climate. And of course, the biggest challenge in our endeavor is the usual Goliath in the fight for increasing the minimum wage, and that's businesses, particularly big businesses. I confess that the district that I come from in Queens, you know, we're so diverse. We're really known for our wonderful people and our delicious food. And I thought many of the restaurants were going to be upset that I was introducing this measure to raise the minimum wage. Lo and behold, I haven't really gotten many businesses to be upset with me. And I think they largely see that raising the minimum wage for workers means that customers are going to have much more purchasing power. That family will now be able to maybe go out for dinner once a week. Our restaurants are largely empty. They've been struggling since throughout the pandemic, but also currently. So we have actually been able to count on a great coalition of business owners who are out in front talking about precisely how beneficial it would be to raise the minimum wage, not only so that customers have more purchasing power, but also because it helps them retain workers and lessen a turnover, which can actually be costly depending on the business itself. So I guess, you know, that I think about covers where we are with the minimum wage. Right now, we are getting ready to have our one house budgets. So after the governor releases her executive budget, which she did several weeks ago, we just finished yesterday holding all of our budget hearings. They were 13 in total. The labor one was the last one. It ended late last night. And then now, hopefully within a week or two, each house, the Senate and the Assembly, will be releasing their own budget proposals that our leadership will use to negotiate the final budget with Governor Hochul. And we are very hopeful that together with your advocacy and all workers who are fighting for a raise, we will be able to be victorious and see this bill in the final budget as the best proposal to raise the minimum wage in New York right now.
Well, that's very exciting. You mentioned before we started, the timing of this year's budget, right? So could you explain to folks, we thought it was April 1st, but
Yep,
it's
no,
not.
you're absolutely right. Every year, the New York State budget is due on April 1st. But the governor, upon being elected for her first full term, is allowed a grace period of about 2 weeks to present the final budget. So that might play around a little bit with the timing. That might give us a little extra time. That may be a good thing. That might be a bad thing. I don't know yet. But certainly we have to remain relentless in our advocacy for women and workers.
Great. Thank you for explaining that. I did not know that. See, so I really appreciate. Because we've been talking about April 1st as, you know, we're working toward a very close deadline, actually. You know, so and that's why, and people wanted to understand this bill better, particularly. So appreciate that. Now we're talking about the minimum wage and low wage workers, and PowHer for a long time has been involved with one fair wage. So we're going to turn to Inette. Is she there? There you are.
Yes.
Great. To talk about the one fair wage proposal. And I think it would be great to talk about the political aspects of it, but just first tell us about what is this supposed to do and why do you think it's important?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Senator Ramos. We are in full solidarity with everything you've laid out, and of course support increasing the minimum wage for New Yorkers. And thank you, PowHer, for being such a strong ally and inviting us here. My colleague Nyla Rosario couldn't make it, so I'm subbing for her last moment. So, you know, we're talking about the minimum wage, and as people on this call probably already know, we have this very peculiar but very intentional carve out to the minimum wage, which is the sub-minimum wage for tech workers. And in the United States, this goes all the way back to the time of emancipation, thanks to the power of the restaurant industry, which hired newly freed people for $0 wages, forcing them to live off tips. This unfortunately got codified in the New Deal, and New York is one of 43 states that continues to have this carve out, allowing people to not earn the minimum wage of the state they're in. Our bill A1710 would undo this carve out and phase out the sub-minimum tip wage so that all workers may earn a minimum wage, so that further proposals to index or increase the minimum wage would also cover tipped workers who are currently excluded. I just want to put out 3 very quick numbers for New York to sort of explain this a little bit. The workforce that's impacted, the numbers have changed and keep changing because of COVID. As you know, the restaurant industry was affected. Over 500,000 people lost their jobs. Several of them have not yet returned. But the number of people earning a sub-minimum tipped wage in New York varies between 250,000 to about 330,000. Unsurprisingly and unfortunately, this is a majority women, about 60%, and majority person of color workforce, about 40%. The other number that I want to put out is the wage gap number, we did an event with PowHer actually last year on Black Women's Equal Pay Day, and the date is coming later and later of how long it would take a Black woman to earn as much as a white man. And unfortunately, we hold the distinction as the restaurant industry of actually pulling this number further and further away because the wage gap in the restaurant industry is so high. In New York, the wage gap is about $3.01 per hour between a woman of color and a white man for the same job. The last number that I want to put out there is the high rates of sexual harassment that women report. The last time we surveyed workers in New York, they said at least 70% of them experience harassment at least once working in this industry, and this has always been very high and unfortunately increased with COVID. So the impact of the sub-minimum wage is all of these things. And more specifically, it leads to this wage gap, it leads to harassment. And One Fair Wage as a campaign advocates for the end of the sub-minimum dipped wage, which is what this bill would do, so that going forward, all workers continue to increase their wages whenever there's a state increase in minimum wage. As Senator Ramos said, the opposition is actually very different and muted. Several restaurants in New York have already done this. And the budget component of our bill would support restaurants that want to get there quicker and give them financial support to do that. And the last thing I'll say is that in 2016, when New York was, I think, the first state to increase its minimum wage to $15 an hour, leading nationally. At that time, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers was about 80% of the minimum wage. It got negotiated down to 60%. So today, if you're a tipped worker in New York, you earn 2/3 of the state minimum wage. And again, in 2019, when there was a commission set up to study the phase out of the sub-minimum wage, nail salon workers, car wash workers were given it, but restaurant workers were left out. So just to say that our opposition is very united. The National Restaurant Association lobbies against ending the sub-minimum wage and against increasing the minimum wage. And so we commit to continuing to stay united with all our allies and push for this bill this session.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I know that was a very big disappointment in 2019 when they carve out, because you had worked so hard to eliminate the sub-minimum wage, but it was not for restaurant workers in the end. And everyone, just make sure you know that the fight in New York is part of a national fight. There are other states that are working to end this sub-minimum wage as well. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you for that question. For 7 states already have one fair wage. We are very proud to have added an 8th state to this last year. In November, in the midterm elections in DC, voters overwhelmingly voted to phase out the sub-minimum wage. Workers there are going to get a raise from about $5 an hour to $16 an hour. Though currently, we also this year have bills moving in Maryland, as well as in Illinois.
It's exciting. And Saru, who's been with us, at other times, is also an incredible advocate for this. So it felt like nothing was going to happen, and all of a sudden there are states coming on, and hopefully New York will be one of those. So thank you so much for all this work. So now we are really, so lucky to have some extraordinary advocates, just to fill in, information about who are we talking about, and what impact might this have on low-wage workers, particularly women. So I think Mervil will talk in a bit. We're saying, legislators often make policy, but they don't actually, know the real lives of people. And so it's how important it is for us to understand, what a raise in the minimum wage would do, for so many workers. So I'm going to turn first to Yannette for you to talk. You're from NELP, and I know that there's a big campaign. So talk about that, and then also what you anticipate in terms of the ramifications of changing the minimum wage.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you for everyone who's listening in. So NELP is involved in this campaign. As you may know, we are research and advocacy organization, and we have expertise on minimum wage and other labor policies. We are working with a coalition of community groups of labor unions and of worker rights organizations, and we're both in support of both policies, Raise the Wage Act and the One Fair Wage Bill that Inayat mentioned. We believe that in New York, there's a need for substantially higher wages. As we all know, the pandemic and now inflation have taken a toll on the value of the current minimum wage, 15 in New York City and in the downstate suburbs, and inching up to 15 upstate. Obviously, the real value of those wages are much lower than they were when they were first when the law was first approved back in 2016, and now with high inflation, it's even lower. Obviously, we are also interested in the elimination of the tipped wage. It's it's a matter of equity. It's a matter of good policy. It's a matter of not carving out any workers from fair wages. The coalition is diverse. It represents the communities that are affected. And it's going well, hopefully. We're excited to be a part of it.
I know that you were one of the folks who testified for the Department of Labor hearing, and you particularly honed in on the relationship with the minimum wage and the gender wage gap. So you pulled out some really interesting information on that. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so there are various factors that influence the gender wage gap. One of them is pay, obviously. And what we understand is that, well, so women are typically one of the groups most affected by or most overrepresented among underpaid workers, and therefore they're most impacted by minimum wage and tipped wage policies. So the relationship there is that if in fact the Raise the Wage Act and or the elimination of the tipped wage were to be approved, that what that means is that the pay of women would be lifted up along with other workers, and that would affect the ratio of women's to men's pay. That means, as women's pay, as workers, underpaid workers' wages go up, given that the women are a significant or a majority of those underpaid workers, then their wages as a group would go up, and that would really affect the ratio of their pay to men's pay.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. I mean, in our work around equal pay, certainly we talk about there's going to not be equity until the work that women do is valued, and so many women are working in low wage jobs. So I'm really happy to ask Amarita to jump in here. Amarita Torres is the policy person at Community Service Society, which is how old? 100 years old?
Over 175 years. I know.
Oh
we've been around.
And you've not that long, you've been there.
No.
but you have been tracking this and doing this work, looking at the needs of New Yorkers, particularly New York City folks, right?
Yeah.
For a very long time. And so we've worked on a number of campaigns together now. And Marita, what can you share with us that gives us more information on these workers you have? I know the Unheard Third project that has been continuous for Community Service Society, and you really looked at these particular workers. So what have you learned?
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Thank you to Power, to the senator, to everyone who's here. We're strongly supportive of all the bills being discussed. In CSS, we've been fighting for equity for low-income New Yorkers for quite a long time, including for the fight for 15 and now for increasing the minimum wage and also eliminating the sub minimum wage for tipped workers. What we see is that, increasing the minimum wage is going to benefit millions of New Yorkers. I think the latest estimate we saw, I believe is what was from NELP actually, that particularly the senator's bill would benefit 2.9 million New Yorkers. They would experience some kind of an increase in their wage. We see that it's going to be especially beneficial for low-income working women of color the most, as we've heard from the speakers today, many of whom are in home care, childcare, restaurant workers within the hospitality industry as well. And we know that working low-income women of color are often at the receiving end of double and even triple discrimination, whether it's race, class, gender. They're experiencing some kind of discrimination in the labor market. For example, the median wage of a Latina woman is only $55,000. That's almost half of what a non-Latina or non-Latino white male would earn. So that just shows the differences. And you mentioned the unheard third. So the unheard third is a survey that that CSS has done over the last 20 years. It's the longest running survey of low-income New Yorkers, including low-income workers, in the US. And it provides us with tremendous insight on what's happening in New York City with regards to low-income New Yorkers, policies that we might want to suggest, and just generally what's happening, what insights we can kind of come up with. A couple of things I'll share why this is so important. It's because what we saw in 2022, 62% of low-income working mothers reported worrying about making ends meet mostly all of the time. And almost a quarter did not have any rainy day savings at all. The senator mentioned this. Low-income workers don't have like $1, $10 saved for when something happens, when there's a funeral, when someone is sick, COVID hits. They don't have any savings. Around 30% of working women and working moms had student debt and medical bills that they struggled to pay. 2/3 put off continuing their education. 54% skipped buying basic necessities. 45% could not afford to even save for retirement. So the folks that we're talking about, low-income working mothers, struggle with this. On the housing front, especially, 70% of low-income women, including mothers, say that they were not able to make their rent, make their mortgage. That was a challenge. 22% faced eviction threats. So these are the kinds of things that this population in particular faces.
Those are really stunning numbers, and they represent people, people, their lives, their families. And I was struck when I looked at the program, the report last year, just about how people are not prepared for any rainy day, any setback, and then what happens then to them. I think you talk about what happens when you can't make ends meet. Do you want to just share a little bit about what your findings on that?
Sure. I mean, we're seeing really high levels of eviction rates. I mentioned 22%. That number is equally high across New York City. I'll say also in terms of just the housing piece, because housing is really sort of the foundation. We earn a living, we pay for our housing, we rent, we pay a mortgage. I mentioned 70% of all low-income women had failed or had a challenge with making rent or making their mortgage. 60% are already behind on rent or expect to fall behind this year on their rent or their mortgage payment. Another issue is food insecurity, and this is a particular issue. I want to say it's affecting New Yorkers across the board, but especially the Latino population in New York City. Food insecurity, especially for low-income single mothers, has become a particular issue, and many of whom are minimum wage workers.
And thank you for all that and all that work. It's really helpful. Just looking, by the way, everyone just check out the chat. Sahir put some really great statistics in there and put any questions in there. But let's just finish with our panel. And I want to turn to Merville Reagan. Merville and I go back a little ways. And one of the things we connected on, Merville, was what was called then the self-sufficiency standard that you and your organization had created. And I guess it's a reality check. How much does it really cost to live in New York City? Now, I know on this call today, we have folks from across the state, but it's still expensive everywhere, right? You know, so just looking at the reality of people's lives, can you give us a sense of, you know, what the needs are, and maybe, you know, what would happen if there was more income?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bev, for this opportunity. At the end of April of this year, we'll be releasing the 7th, what used to be called self-sufficiency report. I think most of you know that the ballot measure, the true cost of living in New York City, was passed in November. So now the work begins on determining exactly what those numbers are. So for years, we have complained about the fact that the well-being of working people in New York City and New York State has been based on the poverty measure, which, as you all know, has very little bearing on the reality of the lives of people that you have just talked about. So the numbers on the report have been embargoed until the end of April of this year, but I can give you some of the information that we have determined. One is that New York City has over 1 million households that don't have sufficient incomes. 80% of the households below the true cost of living have at least one working adult. 79% of the people below that pay more than 30% of their income toward their cost of housing. And I could go on and on about the numbers. But in response to your request, Bev, I'd like to give some examples of what's happened to working families in New York City over the last 23 years by just rattling off some statistics. So the true cost of living measures what it costs to live and work in New York City based on where you live and the ages and numbers of your children. And so, for example, in the year 2000 in the Bronx, it cost a family with 2 adults, 1 4-year-old and 1 10-year-old about $50,000 to make ends meet. In 2023, it cost $107,000. We make a distinction among the people who live in the Bronx, Queens, Staten Island, Northwest Brooklyn, the rest of Brooklyn, North Manhattan, and South Manhattan. And we calculate these numbers for over 700 families in each geographic area, starting with a single adult and going all the way up to 4 adults and 3 teenagers. What's clear and what's been clear to us for a number of years is that $15 an hour does not even support a single person in any part of New York City. So we are urging public policy people and advocates to move away from the poverty measure and to work toward making policies based on what it actually costs people to live and work in New York City. And we think the newest tool, which will be the 7th report since the year 2000, using the numbers that will be available to everyone by the end of April to inform public policy going forward on behalf of our low-wage working families.
Those are stunning numbers, Maribel.
Yeah,
Really shocking how much.
If you're interested, I can just sort of rattle them off for all 5 areas. It is rather shocking.
Well, give us more.
Okay, I'm sorry, let me go back to, sorry, I lost my number.
That's okay. I mean, these are people, their families.
Okay,
right?
so in Brooklyn, the balance of Brooklyn, the cost was $50,000 in the year 2000, and it's now over it's $142,000 for Northwest Brooklyn. For Staten Island, it went from $50,000 in the year 2000 to $110,000 in 2023. In Queens, $51,000 to $115,000 in 2023. South Manhattan from $75,000 to $151,000. North Manhattan, 52,000 to 123,000. I mean, what that means is that our public policies, therefore, since most people are not earning that kind of money, should include a discussion that involves not just wages, but also work supports that help working families meet their families' needs. So we urge everyone to move away from the poverty measure and to make public policy based on the reality of working people's lives.
And that's what you changed the name of this report to, the true cost of living,
Exactly.
right? Yeah. So that's an eye opener, Marble, but people they just struggle, right? If it's a
I mean, the point is they've been struggling all along, but when we talk about their struggles vis-a-vis the poverty measure, it doesn't seem as dramatic as the reality of their lives.
Right. So now, thank you, Marble. So we talked, all of you sort of have given us really a lot to think about here. Senator Ramos, are you still there? If you are, just say hi. There you are. I just want to give you a chance to respond to what we've been talking about. There you go.
Hi, yes. Well, the situation has been pretty dire for women. I mean, particularly in Queens, right? And I really appreciate all of the figures and stats that Ms. Marble and the previous speakers had been sharing, particularly NELP, who has been such a key partner in our endeavor. I mean, look, we know that the rent is too damn high. We've been hearing that as a slogan for a long time, but the fact is, it's getting harder and harder to buy a home. And that's something that I think every New Yorker, particularly those of color, those of us who are children of immigrants, I'm the daughter of Colombian immigrants, it's what we strive for. And unfortunately, the proposal that we saw in the executive just doesn't cut it. It only really comes out to $13 a week, which I think in New York City won't even buy you lunch. And our proposal is a little more ambitious, and would result in $3,300 extra for 3 million workers, or 2.9. I'm sorry, I'm like Janet said from NELP, a year, which comes out to, I think, a little more like than $68 a week, which, adds up. And that's only in the first year. So actually what we would love, and what would be very helpful to us in this fight, is to have as many groups sign on to our legislative efforts as possible. And I believe Tal from our Raise the Wage campaign is going to share information in the chat about how to sign on to our letter so that the governor hears our voices loud and clear.
Yes, and we've Sahara Rojas on the call, and we have put that letter out. So we happen to have quite a number of organizations on the call this morning. So guys, what we're about is action. We want to learn, but if learning's not enough, we have to take action. So if
Bev, and I'm sorry, but Bev, and your action works, right? And this is stuff. I started out by talking about our salary transparency wins at both, yes, the state level with me, but at the city level too. And this is really important because there's proof that when we work together and unite our voices around these causes, we will be heard. So please do, keep working with PowHer, keep working with us to get this done.
Thank you so much. There's a particular question that John O'Malley is posing, and that's about the surplus. I guess there's an almost $9 billion surplus, in addition to 800 million expected in the next 30-day amendment, something like that. Can you
Yes.
explain that? John always knows so much.
He does, and I don't know that we needed to get that wonky here. We don't know what the 30-day amendments are going to be quite yet. Yes, there is a surplus in this year's budget, and we of course want to make sure that those dollars go where they're needed. I mean, I'll tell you that in addition to raising the minimum wage, I'm fighting for increases to childcare access and eligibility. I mean, as a single mom myself, I mean, if I wasn't a senator, I'd be quite a statistic, right? I mean, we know that single moms are much more on the verge of eviction than anyone else, among other situational realities of our state. So yeah, we want to make sure that that money is going to the right place. And in terms of the minimum wage, that is certainly for our home care workers and our nurses and many others who deserve real wages.
Right, thank you. Last week we did, last briefing, we did talk about the child care and home care workers, you know, so we're very attuned to that, and that's very much part of it. Power came out of the Equal Pay campaign, you know, we're an expansion of that. So, you know, very, very strongly positioning our messaging around, you know, valuing women's work. These are workers who work hard, and they're not being paid, you know, adequately compared to other jobs that men have. So, you know, it's not an easy lift, but we continue to do that. So let's see. I'm going to give a chance to the speakers. There aren't a lot of questions coming in, which surprises me actually, because this group is usually full of questions. But certainly there's a question about action and, you know, what are actions that can be taken. And also everyone note that we will share these great links that we have here. But let me give just a round robin it and give, Yanette, do you want to add anything to, you know, what we've been talking about here?
Yeah, and I was just typing it on the chat, but
Okay.
speaking of single parents, about 48% of single parents in the state would benefit from the Raise the Wage Act. So that tells you like the type of struggle that especially single moms face, and how much they could benefit from this policy. Let me take so one thing that I think we could go over a little bit is some of the differences between the Raise the Wage Act and what the governor is proposing. Maybe that may be of
yes, that would be helpful.
Okay, great. So I think the main difference is that the governor's proposal would only, and I believe Senator Ramos already mentioned this, but the governor's proposal would only index the minimum wage going forward. So index it from 15 in New York City and the suburbs, index it once it gets to 15, I believe, upstate. You know, indexing the minimum wage is typically something that we as a policy organization advise, but it's important to index it from a strong, robust level. We don't want to index it from a level that is no longer, you know, a living wage. So indexing the minimum wage in New York from 15 is not advisable at this point, because 15 just does not have the same value as it did, you know, 10 years ago. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that the governor's proposal would cap in future cost of living adjustments at 3%. Not the greatest policy, because, you know, we are facing still high inflation. In times of high inflation, we cannot tell workers, well, I'm sorry, but you know, your wages have to be capped because I guess the economy doesn't allow for anything else. That's not the best approach to take. The Raise the Wage Act would have none of that. First of all, it raises the minimum wage to $21.25 by around 2026, 2027. And then indexes the future adjustments to both inflation, but also to gains in worker productivity, so that not only do workers keep up with inflation, but also they share in the profits of what their labor produces. So that's one of the main differences. And this has been mentioned before, the governor's proposal would only affect about from 900,000 to about 1 million workers, depending on who's doing the estimation. The Raise the Wage Act would benefit almost 3 million workers. So that's a huge difference right there in terms of, you know, who's impacted. And the last thing I'll say is that in this already it was mentioned, but the Wage Act would increase workers' pay by about annual pay by an average of $3,300. As opposed to the governor's proposal, which is much more it's meager, to be honest. It would only increase on an annual basis by about $670, which is very, very tiny of an increase, annual increase. I mean, everything helps, but you know, like if you have a proposal there that would have a bigger impact, why not go with that?
Right. How do you get to 2125 for the?
Yeah, so that is 2125 includes bringing up the $15 minimum wage to basically restore the value of that. That's included in the calculation. It includes that plus what we expect to be increases in inflation over the next few years. Remember, 2125 by 2026, 2027. So it includes restoring the value 15 plus indexing in the next couple of to inflation in the next couple of days, plus the gains in worker productivity. So that's how we came up with 2125.
Thank you, Senator Ramos. Is there any adjustments for the area of New York that someone would live in?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked, Bev. We do have slightly different paths towards 2125 for the different regions, for New York City, for the suburbs, and for upstate. And suburbs, think like Long Island, you know, or maybe Hudson Valley, where actually the Raise the Wage Act is polling the highest. Because this is one of the most popular policy ideas in New York State right now. But I'm very sad to say that with the current minimum wage law, upstate still hasn't gotten to $15 an hour. Yeah. It's really rough up here. I say that as I'm sitting in Albany. But essentially by 2023, New York City and the suburbs I'm sorry, at 2023, we're at $15 here. Upstate is at $14.20 right now. And if we were to pass the Raise the Wage Act by January 2024, this coming January, New York City and the suburbs would be at $17.25 and upstate would be at $16. And this is really important because under the governor's plan, we wouldn't reach $16 by 2030.
Right.
That is a huge difference.
Yeah. Right.
So we are keeping somewhat of a regional model, keeping in mind the different business environments. We are trying to put forth a very sensible and feasible plan, but also ones that answer the concerns in the cost of living for workers.
Right. So let me just get, Marita, did you want to add anything, or Margot?
Not really. I think just in the broader context of this, when we think about the economy and boosting the economy and consumer spending, this is a population, those who earn minimum wage, low-income workers, low-income working women, that have not received the kind of equitable growth and attention that other populations and corporations have received. So when we think about how we can boost our economy, this is the way. These are the kinds of policies that we support, that folks across the state should support, because this is what's going to boost our economy. When we think about consumer spending, this is going to put money in the pockets of thousands, millions of New Yorkers who need it. And we need to build wealth. These are folks that don't have, as I mentioned, savings. So how can we help these folks build wealth so that we can close a lot of these gaps, whether it's the salary gap, the wealth gap, the many gaps that we need to address.
Right. Margot, any words of wisdom? Other than just do it? Like, let's just get this done. You're on mute.
I didn't hear you.
No, I was just saying if you had anything else to add, I'm going to wrap up. So I just wanted anyone to have, if you wanted.
I would just add this, that this data is also available for all of New York State. The report has not been commissioned for the state, but the data is available. And if we can use these numbers to justify the public policies that are proposed here, I think we'll be in a stronger position.
That's really interesting.
It's one thing to say, well, their salaries can't go up that much, but if you back it up with the fact of this is what it actually costs this particular family, And here's how we could help them with a
Mhm.
combination of raising wages and increasing benefits eligibility, then I think it's not an emotional, it's practical. It's information and
Mhm.
data that can't be argued with.
Yeah, thank you for that, Merle.
Because to do something different, yeah, to do something different means we don't care about our working populations, in particular women. I mean, it's just that simple. And, I mean, I have a lot of friends who are business people, but if business people are surviving on the backs of poor people and low-wage workers, then, what does that
That's
say?
right. That's how it's been, and that's the shift that we're really trying to make. So I hope that the group has gotten kind of the information you need. First of all, number one, to see if your organization is willing to sign on to the letter and be supportive. Now, that's the most, between the two bills, that's coming up first, the Raise the Wage Act. But also have have the data, because when we were fighting for the salary range bill, it was a real turning point when we were able to get the data from Community Service Society. Deb put together this chart, and we were like, that's how many people you're cutting out, if you change the number of employees. And people sort of get it when they get the numbers. So I think that it's really important for us to see just how many people are affected, and how much it costs to live, and how that coordinates with the minimum wage. And there are a number of people on the call, Marvel, as you know, around the state. They represent groups around the state. So if you all are interested in getting that data, it could be arranged. And we always like to bring it local, right? Because every community, it's really important in New York that we bring these issues, to our local communities, because it's such a broad state, and there's so many, it's really, very, very different. And we are very mindful at Power to be respectful and inclusive of upstate, downstate, the whole state,
And I will
so
just say this data is available for all 62 counties in the state.
that's amazing. That's the kind of information that we really need. So I'm going to just wrap this up and say, okay, so we have information. We've got these great champion here of this with our senator, and also Latoya Joyner, who we worked on together with you two on the salary range bill. So that's good history, right? So now, what do we do? So they have a letter, bring it back. I think having this conversation with friends is really important, because people don't, they say, oh, really? $21 an hour, And I think, can really bring it home to them about how people are living without that additional money, and what's the reality of New York, and what's the effect, but also we usually at Power take other actions. So I think on International Women's Day, which is the 8th, there's going to be a Twitter storm for both bills. And so we can be active that day. And of course, Equal Pay Day is March 14th. And we have, the opportunity to be active there too. This just is so in sync with our messaging that it's not just passing laws, it's really changing, our value systems and getting, women's work respected. And that's a big part of the gap as was brought out. So I want to thank everyone. The speakers are all available to you to get more information. They're going to send any resources to us, and then we'll turn it around probably by Monday and have this out to the folks on the call, as well as our broader network, so that we can share information about this really important issue. Senator Ramos and Marita, Merval, Yannette, thank you so much for being with us this morning. You really added so much to our day. Thank you. Bye.